The winter afternoon was bitter cold in downtown Portland when an elderly woman pulled her old Honda Civic into the loading zone outside Pine Street Apartments. At 78 years old, she moved slowly but purposefully, her silver hair neatly tucked under a worn wool hat. She had just finished her weekly grocery shopping, something that had become increasingly challenging since her daughter's recent hip surgery. The trunk of her car was packed with plastic bags. She had picked up extra supplies for the neighborhood food bank, where she volunteered 3 times a week. Despite her own limited pension, she always made sure to buy additional items for families struggling to make ends meet. Many residents in the area knew her as the retired teacher who had taught at Lincoln Elementary for 4 decades, shaping young minds with patience and kindness. As she struggled to lift the first batch of heavy bags, a police cruiser pulled up behind her car. Officer Richard stepped out, his boots crunching on the salt-covered sidewalk. Instead of offering assistance to the obviously struggling woman, he immediately adopted an aggressive stance, hand resting on his belt. "Ma'am, you can't park here," he barked, his voice carrying across the quiet street. "This is a loading zone." The elderly woman turned slowly, her arthritic hands still clutching the grocery bags. "I'm sorry, officer. I'm just unloading these groceries. My daughter usually helps, but she's recovering from surgery. I'll only be a few minutes." Officer Richard's response was immediate and harsh. "I don't care about your excuses. Rules are rules." He pulled out his ticket book, making a show of writing while standing uncomfortably close to her. The woman's hands trembled as she tried to manage the heavy bags. "Please just give me 5 minutes. Some of these groceries are for the food bank." Before she could finish her sentence, Officer Richard bumped into her while moving to check her license plate. The sudden movement caused her to lose her grip on the bags. Cans rolled across the slushy sidewalk, and a carton of eggs shattered on the ground. The elderly woman stood there, watching helplessly as her carefully selected groceries scattered around her feet. A small crowd had begun to gather, watching the scene unfold. Among them was a young college student who had started recording the interaction on their phone. The officer seemed oblivious to the growing number of witnesses, focused instead on writing the ticket with unnecessary flourish. The elderly woman didn't argue or raise her voice. She simply stood there, a single tear rolling down her weathered cheek as she watched the eggs slowly freeze on the concrete. A few onlookers stepped forward to help, but Officer Richard waved them back. "Stay out of this," he warned, his tone unnecessarily threatening. Little did Officer Richard know that this moment would soon spark a chain of events that would change not just his career, but the entire police department's approach to community relations. The video of his interaction with a respected community elder would soon reach far beyond their small corner of Portland, touching hearts and igniting calls for justice across the nation. As the officer finally walked away, ticket in hand, the elderly woman slowly bent down to salvage what she could of her groceries. She didn't know that her quiet dignity in the face of such unwarranted hostility would soon become a powerful symbol of the need for change in how law enforcement interacts with vulnerable citizens. The video of the police officer's cruel treatment spread like wildfire across social media. A college student who captured the incident posted it with the caption, "Watch how this cop treats an elderly woman who feeds our community." Within hours, the clip had thousands of shares. The footage showed everything in painful detail: the officer's aggressive stance, his deliberate bump that sent groceries flying, and most heartbreaking of all, the quiet dignity of the elderly woman as she watched her carefully selected food items scatter across the frozen sidewalk. The angle perfectly captured her trembling hands and the single tear that rolled down her cheek while the officer wrote his ticket with obvious satisfaction. Local community groups began sharing the video, adding context about the woman's decades of service to the neighborhood. "This is the same person who spent 40 years teaching our kids," wrote one local parent. "She still volunteers at the food bank 3 times a week, even at her age. And this is how she gets treated." News channels picked up the story, running it during prime time. Reporters dug deeper, discovering that the groceries weren't just for her. Half were meant for struggling families who relied on the local food bank. The fact that she was only parked there because she was waiting for her daughter, who was recovering from surgery, made the officer's actions seem even more heartless. Comments flooded social media platforms. "My kids were in her class 15 years ago," one former student wrote. "She used to buy school supplies for students who couldn't afford them. She deserves better than this." Another shared, "I see her at the food bank every week, organizing donations even when her arthritis is acting up. She never complains." The police department's social media accounts were overwhelmed with messages demanding action. People shared their own stories of encounters with the same officer, painting a picture of someone who seemed to enjoy wielding his authority, especially against those who couldn't fight back. Downtown businesses near the incident site began putting up signs in their windows. "We stand with our community elders." The local grocery store where she shopped started a donation drive to replace the damaged groceries, though they knew it was about much more than just replacing spilled eggs and canned goods. The video caught the attention of several civil rights organizations who reached out to offer support. But what really touched people's hearts was the elderly woman's response when a reporter finally reached her for comment. "I'm not angry," she said softly. "I'm just disappointed. When I was teaching, I always told my students that those in uniform were there to help us. I still want to believe that's true." As views of the video climbed into the millions, police department officials found themselves under mounting pressure to address not just this incident, but the broader issue of how their officers treated vulnerable community members. The clip had become more than just another viral video. It was now a symbol of the urgent need for change in police conduct and community relations. The community's response to the viral video transformed from online outrage into real-world action. Early on a Tuesday morning, over 200 people gathered outside the police station. They weren't there to protest with angry signs or shouts. Instead, they came with stories. Former students, now grown with children of their own, took turns sharing memories of their beloved teacher. "She stayed after school to help me with math when my parents couldn't afford a tutor," one local business owner recalled, his voice thick with emotion. "She never made me feel ashamed for struggling." A woman in her 30s stepped forward next. "During the recession, when my dad lost his job, she quietly left groceries on our doorstep every week. We never knew it was her until years later. That's the kind of person she is." The local food bank director spoke about how the elderly woman still volunteered despite her own challenges. "Even with her arthritis getting worse, she shows up 3 times a week without fail. She knows every family by name, remembers their children's allergies, and always makes sure special dietary needs are met. Last winter, when we were short-staffed during the snowstorm, she stayed extra hours to make sure everyone got their food boxes." As news crews captured these testimonials, more community members stepped forward. The owner of the corner store described how she always bought extra school supplies in August to give to kids whose families were struggling. The apartment building maintenance worker told everyone about how she taught him English during her lunch breaks, refusing any payment. The crowd grew larger as the day went on. People brought chairs for the elderly to sit in, shared water bottles, and held umbrellas for each other when it started drizzling. They weren't just defending one person. They were standing up for the kind of community they wanted to live in. What struck reporters most was how the elderly woman's impact crossed all community lines. People from different backgrounds, ages, and walks of life stood together, each with their own story about how this retired teacher had touched their lives. A teenager spoke about how she helped him apply for college last year, spending hours revising his essays. A new immigrant family described how she helped them navigate school enrollment for their children. The police chief watched from his office window as more people arrived. On his desk lay dozens of letters from community members, each describing similar acts of kindness from the elderly woman. What had started as a viral video was becoming something much more significant. A moment that forced everyone to question how they treated their community's elders and protectors. By sunset, The gathering had evolved into an impromptu community meeting, with people discussing ways to prevent similar incidents in the future. They weren't just angry about one officer's actions. They were determined to create lasting change in how law enforcement interacted with vulnerable citizens. The internal affairs investigation began quietly but quickly gained momentum. As investigators dug through years of police records, a disturbing pattern emerged. The officer's dashboard camera and body cam footage revealed numerous concerning interactions, especially with elderly citizens and vulnerable members of the community. One investigator spent hours reviewing footage from the past year alone. What she found was troubling. The officer had a habit of targeting older drivers, often using aggressive language and unnecessary intimidation tactics. In one video, he made an elderly man with a cane stand in the rain while writing a ticket for a burnt-out taillight. In another, he berated a senior citizen for taking too long to find her license and registration. The investigation uncovered dozens of civilian complaints that had never made it up the chain of command. Many elderly victims had been too frightened or embarrassed to pursue their grievances. Some worried about retaliation, while others felt their words wouldn't carry weight against a police officer's authority. A retired police sergeant came forward with his own observations. "I tried to report his behavior 3 times before I retired," he revealed during an interview. Each time, the paperwork somehow disappeared. He had friends in the right places who would bury the complaints. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered a pattern in the officer's shift selections. He deliberately chose times and areas where he knew elderly residents were most likely to be out: early morning grocery store runs, afternoon medical appointment hours, and times when Social Security checks were typically cashed at local banks. What shocked investigators most wasn't just the number of incidents, but how the officer seemed to take satisfaction in causing distress. His body camera caught him laughing with another officer after reducing an elderly woman to tears over a minor parking violation. "These old folks need to learn," he was heard saying, unaware his camera was still recording. Local bank employees finally felt safe enough to share their observations. They described watching him regularly park near the bank on days when elderly customers typically cashed their monthly checks. He would wait for minor infractions, a wheel slightly touching the yellow line, a moment too long in a loading zone. The investigation team also uncovered concerning posts on the officer's private social media accounts. He had openly mocked elderly citizens, sharing photos of their confused faces after he'd written them tickets. These posts, though deleted, had been archived by concerned fellow officers who'd never felt empowered to speak up. As the evidence mounted, the investigation expanded beyond just one officer. Questions arose about how such behavior had gone unchecked for so long. Who had protected him? Why were complaints consistently buried? The case was no longer about a single incident caught on video. It had exposed systemic failures in how police accountability was handled. As investigators dug deeper into the officer's past, they uncovered a troubled history that stretched back to his earliest days on the force. Personnel files revealed he had transferred between 3 different police departments in just 5 years, each time moving just before serious complaints could stick. His first posting showed multiple warnings about his aggressive approach to traffic stops. The second department had documented concerns about his attitude toward elderly residents. Yet somehow, these red flags never followed him to his next position. It was a pattern that raised serious questions about the system's ability to track problem officers. Training officers who had worked with him shared their past concerns. He showed signs of trouble early on, one veteran instructor admitted. During role-playing exercises, he would always escalate situations unnecessarily, especially with scenarios involving elderly citizens. We noted it in his evaluations, but nothing came of it. The investigation revealed a darker side to his daily patrol routine. He had mapped out areas where retired residents lived, timing his patrols to coincide with pension check days and medical appointment hours. Body camera footage showed him waiting near senior living communities, ready to pounce on the smallest infractions. His personal laptop, seized during the investigation, contained a spreadsheet tracking his achievements, the number of tickets issued to elderly drivers, the amount of fines collected, and even notes about which victims had cried. It was a disturbing glimpse into the mind of someone who had deliberately targeted the community's most vulnerable members. Fellow officers began opening up about moments they had witnessed but failed to report. A young patrol officer described watching him make an elderly man with a walker stand in the cold while writing a ticket for expired tags. Another recalled him laughing about making a senior citizen miss her doctor's appointment because he delayed her for over an hour during a minor traffic stop. The officer's locker contained more evidence of his contempt for the elderly, printouts of mocking memes about senior citizens, notes about the best spots to catch retirees in minor violations, and even a tally of how many he had made cry during traffic stops. It painted a picture of someone who took pleasure in abusing his authority. What troubled investigators most was how he had managed to hide in plain sight for so long. His superior officers had either missed or ignored countless warning signs. Performance reviews glossed over complaints, focusing instead on his high number of citations and fines collected, metrics that had earned him praise despite the human cost of his actions. The retired teacher's story became more powerful as community members learned about her ongoing impact even after leaving the classroom. Despite living on a modest pension, she had never stopped serving others. Her small apartment had become an unofficial community center, where she offered free tutoring to struggling students and helped elderly neighbors fill out complex forms. A local reporter discovered that she spent nearly half her monthly pension on buying extra groceries for the food bank. During winter months, she would quietly leave warm blankets at the homeless shelter, having spent months knitting them herself despite her arthritis. The shelter staff didn't even know it was her until the police incident brought attention to her acts of kindness. Her former students organized a weekend gathering at the community center, where people could share stories about her impact on their lives. The line of speakers stretched out the door. A local business owner recalled how she had taught his parents English after school, helping them become citizens. Another spoke about how she had paid for his sister's graduation gown when their family couldn't afford it. The city council meeting where she finally spoke brought many to tears. She didn't talk about the officer's cruelty or demand punishment. Instead, she expressed concern about how fear of law enforcement was affecting her elderly neighbors. "They're afraid to go grocery shopping," she explained softly. "Some have missed doctor's appointments because they're scared of being pulled over. This isn't the community we should be." Her words carried extra weight because everyone knew her history of quiet service. When floods hit the city 5 years ago, she had turned her small apartment into a temporary shelter for displaced elderly neighbors. During the recent pandemic, she organized a phone chain to check on isolated seniors, ensuring everyone had food and medication. What touched people most was learning that even after the incident, she continued her volunteer work without interruption. The day after the video went viral, she was back at the food bank, sorting donations and checking on regular visitors. When asked why she didn't take time off, she simply said, "People are counting on these groceries. Their needs don't stop because I had a bad day." Local businesses began collecting stories about her decades of quiet kindness. The grocery store owner remembered how she would discreetly tell him which families were struggling, ensuring he could accidentally give them extra items in their bags. The pharmacy shared how she regularly helped elderly customers understand their medications, often spending hours explaining prescriptions to those who lived alone. The police department's response came swiftly and decisively. The chief called an emergency meeting with all department heads, bringing in community leaders and civil rights experts. The footage had made it impossible to ignore the systemic issues within their ranks. First came immediate action. The officer was placed on unpaid leave pending termination proceedings. But the department knew this couldn't be the end. They announced comprehensive reforms that would reshape how officers interact with elderly citizens. The new training program would be named after the retired teacher, focusing on compassion and understanding when dealing with senior citizens. Every officer would spend time volunteering at senior centers and food banks, learning firsthand about the challenges elderly residents face daily. Body camera reviews became mandatory, with special attention paid to interactions with vulnerable populations. The department created a civilian review board, giving community members real power and oversight. Half the board members would be senior citizens, ensuring their perspective wouldn't be overlooked again. The most significant change came in how officers were evaluated. Instead of focusing on citation numbers and fines collected, the new system would measure community engagement and positive interactions. Officers who showed exceptional kindness and understanding would be recognized and rewarded. A special unit was created specifically for elderly assistance. These officers would receive additional training in helping seniors with mobility issues, understanding medical emergencies, and recognizing signs of confusion or distress. Their patrol cars would carry emergency supplies like blankets, water, and basic first aid kits. The department also established a direct hotline for elderly residents to report concerns without fear. Each complaint would be thoroughly investigated, with regular updates provided to the person who reported it. Anonymous reporting options were made available for those still hesitant to come forward. Local businesses joined the effort, creating safe spaces where elderly citizens could wait if they needed police assistance. These senior safe spots would have trained staff members who could help calm nervous residents and ensure proper treatment by responding officers. The reforms weren't just about rules and procedures, they represented a fundamental shift in police culture. Officers were encouraged to build relationships with elderly residents to know their needs and concerns. Regular community meetings were scheduled where seniors could voice their concerns directly to police leadership. Rather than pursuing legal action, the elderly retired teacher chose a path that surprised everyone. She requested a restorative justice meeting with the officer who had wronged her. The meeting was set in a small community center room with trained mediators present. The officer arrived first, visibly nervous and dressed in civilian clothes. When the retired teacher walked in, carrying a basket of homemade cookies, the tension in the room shifted. She placed the basket on the table and quietly sat down, her gentle presence filling the space. "I'd brought these because difficult conversations are easier with something sweet to share," she said, pushing the basket toward him. The simple gesture brought unexpected tears to the officer's eyes. For the first time, he saw her not as a target for his authority, but as someone who reminded him of his own grandmother. The conversation that followed was deeply moving. The retired teacher spoke about how the incident affected not just her, but the entire elderly community. She described friends too scared to go shopping, neighbors missing medical appointments, and seniors feeling like prisoners in their own homes. But what struck the officer most was her question. "What happened in your life to make you so angry at people like me?" The question wasn't accusatory. It was filled with genuine concern. For the first time in his career, the officer found himself opening up about his own past. He spoke about growing up with grandparents who had abandoned his family, about the bitterness he'd carried for years. As he talked, he realized how he had transferred that anger onto other elderly people, using his badge as a weapon to hurt those who reminded him of his pain. The retired teacher listened without judgment. When he finished, she shared stories of other troubled students she'd helped over the years. "Pain that isn't transformed is transferred," she told him. But it's never too late to change that pattern. To everyone's surprise, she invited him to volunteer with her at the food bank. "Come see what it's like on the other side," she suggested. "Meet the elderly people you've been ticketing. Learn their stories. Maybe then, writing tickets won't feel like victory anymore." The incident that began with a viral video transformed into a nationwide model for police reform. 1 year later, the changes were remarkable. The retired teacher and the former officer now worked together, traveling to police academies across the country to share their story. Their presentation always began with the original video. But it didn't end there. They showed what happened next, how restorative justice led to real change. The former officer would speak honestly about his past behavior, while the retired teacher shared how forgiveness could lead to transformation. The training program they developed became mandatory in police departments nationwide. It focused on understanding elderly citizens' challenges through real experience. Officers spent time in senior centers, helped at food banks, and learned about the physical and emotional struggles of aging. The most powerful part of their program was the walk in their shoes exercise. Officers wore special suits that simulated arthritis and vision problems, then tried to perform simple tasks like counting change or reading fine print on tickets. This exercise opened many eyes to the daily challenges elderly citizens face. Their story reached beyond law enforcement. Local governments began reviewing their policies on elderly citizens. Cities installed better lighting in areas where seniors frequently walked, improved accessibility in public spaces, and created special parking zones with longer time limits near medical facilities. The food bank where it all started became a hub of community healing. Every Wednesday, police officers volunteered alongside elderly residents, breaking down barriers one conversation at a time. The retired teacher's cookie recipe became famous. She baked them for every volunteer session, bringing people together over simple acts of kindness. What touched people most was how the former officer transformed. He now spent his retirement years helping elderly residents with home repairs, driving them to appointments, and teaching other officers about the importance of compassion. His journey from causing fear to spreading kindness became a powerful testimony to the possibility of change. The retired teacher continued her work at the food bank, but now with a new purpose. She created a program where troubled officers could volunteer, working alongside the elderly residents they once intimidated. Many found, like the first officer, that understanding replaced anger when they saw the humanity in those they served. The lasting impact wasn't just in change policies or new training programs. It was in the countless small moments of connection between officers and elderly citizens. The simple act of helping someone with their groceries or taking time to listen to their stories became part of police culture, proving that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of kindness.